Theo North arrived at the Ridgetop Lodge before the first guests, his old F-150 crunching over stubborn spring ice as a pale Alaskan sun slid along the mountains like a slow spotlight. And he stood for a moment with his hand on the truck door, steadying his breath the way he always did before a big job, because today was work of a different kind. His daughter's wedding, a day he had helped build line by line on invoices and quiet transfers. Heaters for the terrace, an extra generator in case the wind turned, a pastry redesign when the first baker backed out. All of it in place, so Rachel would never feel the cold that still lived in the seams of May. He walked inside with his suit jacket folded over his arm, nodded to the florist fixing a white rose that leaned the wrong way, and checked the view through the glass wall where the Chugach peaks held the horizon like sleeping giants. And then he smiled because Rachel, in her robe and curlers, peeked around a door and whispered, "Hi, Dad?" And he only said, "Perfect," because he knew not to crowd the moment. By late afternoon, the chandeliers sent warm coins of light across polished wood, the string quartet tried the first bars of a waltz, and the room began to fill with people whose shoes clicked and voices floated. And Theo moved from table to table the way he moved through a warehouse, counting chairs and centerpieces without looking like he was counting, seeing a wobble here, a missing water carafe there, quietly solving it with a nod to staff. And when the ceremony started on the terrace, he stood behind the last row, hands folded, a straight line in the soft wind, and watched Rachel take vows with Jake, while the long northern light stretched over the tundra and made everything look gentler than it was. After the cheers and the photos and the clasping of hands, the reception unfurled in neat stages. Cocktail hour with little smoked salmon bites, the slide to dinner as candles found their rhythm, servers flowing like a practiced river. And Theo took his seat near the aisle because he liked an exit he could see. He liked the way a room spoke if you sat still long enough. He noticed Jake's coworkers in a crescent near the bar, their badges clipped to belts out of habit, one with a sterling tech lapel pin that flashed each time he laughed. He noticed the groom's boss at table 6. A polite man with a straight spine who looked like he measured his words before he spent them. And he noticed Rachel's face across the room, calm and bright, and a little sharpened at the edges with the adrenaline of being center stage. Dinner plates came and went, toasts began, and the maid of honor stood and started with soft stories that made people lean in. But the tone tilted when she said, with a grin she must have practiced, that Theo was in a late life crisis. And then she made finger quotes because the room liked symbols, and the room laughed because laughter travels fast in warm air. And Theo lifted his glass to his lips and set it down again without drinking because his hands had always preferred purpose to comfort, and he studied the way the sound rolled off the glass and into silence. And then Rachel stood for her turn with the microphone, and she was beautiful. Theo thought that first. And then she said she wanted to thank everyone and also talk about her dad, who was at 68, trying to build an empire. And there was more laughter and a joke about fishing and how maybe spreadsheets were a safer sport than dating for him. And Theo felt the heat climb his neck the way a cold chain fails from the weak link first. And he held still because he had promised not to talk about work tonight. He had promised to just blend in. And that promise was a rope he kept coiled tight in his hands. The staff at the service door tried not to smile at a line about playing CEO. A cousin tapped his shoulder and said, "Good for you for staying busy." And the sound in the room turned from music to a hum of small judgments that settled on him like a steady snowfall. And still he stayed calm, because calm had saved loads and lives when weather turned. Calm had rewired warehouses and rerouted barges in black winter. And calm would carry him through a speech that mistook his years for useless weight. He looked to table 6 and saw the groom's boss glance at him with a puzzled squint, the kind a person gets when they hear a familiar song without the words. And Theo returned a small nod, nothing more. And then Rachel finished with a line about expiration dates on dreams. People clapped, the quartet resumed, and the room broke apart into after-dinner drift. Some toward the terrace, where breath fogged a little in the lingering chill. Some toward the bar, where ice knocked in short glasses. And Theo stood to stretch his back and decided he would leave after cake because there are moments a man knows to walk away from. Not in defeat, but in care for what cannot be fixed in one night. He stepped aside to let a server pass and heard a guest say that Alaska was a fine place to slow down. And he said, "It is, because simple answers are best when minds are closed." And then Jake came and clapped him on the shoulder, light but claiming, and thanked him for being a good sport about the jokes, and said Rachel was just having fun, and maybe it was better he didn't pressure himself with the consulting thing. And Theo asked, "What do you think I do?" And Jake shrugged and said something about paperwork for local shops in the room, bright and noisy. Felt suddenly far away, like Theo was watching through thick glass. He excused himself to the restroom, let the cold water bite his wrists, watched his breath steady in the mirror, and when he returned, the lodge sounded new, as if the building had decided to listen, because the groom's boss was stepping away from table 6 with his champagne half forgotten and his eyes on Theo. And he came close and said, polite as a man knocking on a cabin door, "Mr. North, I'm Robert Anderson." And they spoke softly about operations and a name, TK North, that floated between them like frost smoke. And Theo answered in simple lines that did not show their depth. And in Robert's face, the pieces began to slide into place. One, then another, then the next, as if a map he knew by heart had been turned right side up at last. Robert swallowed wrong, coughed, and glanced toward the microphone in the corner where the band leader stood choosing the next song, and the air in the room thinned in a way Theo recognized from the seconds before an announcement changes the shape of a day, and he understood that silence was coming. And he understood that he could stop it with a word, and he understood that he would not. Because there are times when truth ought to walk into a room on its own feet, unpushed, and take whatever chair it chooses. Outside, the light stretched stubbornly along the horizon. Inside, the laughter slowed, as if it sensed a weather shift. Rachel spun in a circle of friends with her veil brushing a sequined shoulder, and Theo stood with his hands easy at his sides, like a man who has shoveled his driveway for 40 winters and knows the rhythm of work and the timing of rest. And the night, which had begun as a roast under chandeliers, leaned toward a quiet that would make people hold their forks in midair and look up when a voice began to speak. 2 years earlier, Theo North stood in a one-bedroom apartment near the Anchorage Coastal Trail, a second-hand table under the window, a hot mug leaving a ring on cheap wood, and he told himself the truth in plain words. The company had restructured, which meant younger workers were cheaper, and his marriage had ended without a scene, just quiet distance that turned into 2 new addresses. And he was 66 with a truck that always started and a mind that would not sit still. Snow pushed against the glass and the winter light was thin, but he felt something like a small engine starting inside him, slow at first, then steady, and he decided his years were not an anchor but a toolbox. He wrote a name on a blank page, Northgate Ventures, and below it he wrote 3 lines. Move goods better, waste nothing, keep promises. He chose to sign emails as TK North because he did not want attention, only results, and because he wanted rooms to judge the work, and not the age of the hands that did it. He began with one consulting job for a small warehouse that always ran late. He walked the aisles with a yellow pad, counted steps, timed turns, labeled shelves, cut 2 motions out of every pick, and built a simple board on the wall that showed truth at a glance. Orders in green, delays in red, no excuses. 2 weeks later, the owner called him a miracle, and Theo wrote down what really happened. Not a miracle, just a map. Word moved along the docks and airstrips the way it always does in Alaska, fast and quiet. And a second job arrived at a fish processor where the blast freezer felt tired. He checked power draw, gasket seals, defrost cycles, and compressor noise, found the leak, fixed the schedule, saved the product, and left with a handshake and a promise to call if anything else groaned. He kept his routine simple. Up before dawn, coffee at Snow City Cafe, notes in a small notebook, calls with crews who liked that he listened more than he talked. He asked questions no one else asked, like who changed the filter last, and why the light over Bay 3 flickered at night. And men who had worked there for 20 years began to smile when they saw him, because they understood he respected what they knew. The first chance to buy came from a woman in Seward who owned a cold storage company with good bones and bad debt. Theo read the books, walked the floors, ate lunch in the break room, and decided the operation could breathe if someone cut waste and cared about the numbers every day, not just at month end. He bought it with a modest loan, kept every worker, changed the layout, installed sensors that texted alarms before the temperature drifted, and met every driver at least once to hear where time vanished on the road. The second buy was a small data firm in Fairbanks that tracked fuel use for bush planes. The owner wanted to retire, but hated the idea of shutting the doors. Theo bought the software, kept the staff, and asked them to make the dashboard simple enough for a tired pilot to read in the dark. They did, and fuel waste fell for 3 airlines in a month. He added a maintenance yard in Seward because he wanted control of repairs, then an IT backbone outfit in Seattle with clients in Anchorage, and finally a logistics system called Borealis Systems that linked orders, trucks, planes, and freezers into one picture anyone could trust. Each move was small on paper, but together they formed a chain with fewer weak links, and Theo watched the graphs bend the right way and said nothing loud about it. He kept the old F-150. He kept the apartment. He bought a better pair of snow tires and one warm jacket that did not shout. He built a team quietly. Sierra from Bethel, who could hear a bad bearing from a room away. Marco, who treated a checklist like a lifeline. Otto, who smiled and then solved problems no one could name. He told them the same thing on their first day. We tell the truth fast, we fix small before it becomes big, and we leave things better than we found them. And they did. He tried to tell Rachel small pieces when they met for dinner. A freezer saved, a route improved, a contract won. She smiled and changed the subject to wedding colors and weekend trips. And once she said, "Dad, you should fish more. This business thing is a phase." And he nodded because he did not want to fight over a plate of salmon when the food was hot and the night was short. When she got engaged to Jake, he shook the young man's hand and felt the quick squeeze that meant confidence and youth. He offered to help with the wedding, and Rachel accepted fast, then asked him, gently but firm, not to pitch his consulting to Jake's coworkers because they were serious tech people. And he promised he would be quiet because he loved her and because he did not need to prove anything at a party. He did not tell her that Borealis Systems, the quiet software in his chain, powered parts of Sterling Tech, the very company that paid Jake. He did not tell her that Robert Anderson, Jake's boss, had signed 3 contracts with TK North after blunt, efficient calls in which problems were named and solved. Anderson had never met him, only his Anchorage lead, and so his picture of TK North was built from clean deliverables and invoices that matched promises. The winter before the wedding was hard. A storm shut down a highway, a transformer failed at midnight, and a plane diverted with sensitive cargo. Theo stayed awake for 30 hours with his team, rerouting loads, calling favors, paying overtime without being asked. And when morning finally came, the city ate breakfast as if nothing had almost gone wrong. He drove home in weak light and felt the quiet pride of a job done the right way. Spring came late, as it often does, and his sister sent brochures for retirement communities with a pool, and he laughed, thanked her, and put them in a drawer with old maps. He did not want a pool. He wanted problems worth solving. He kept a ledger of small good things, a driver who made it home for his kid's school play because the route was smarter, a vendor who got paid early and cried, a freezer that held tight through a power dip because the alarm woke a tech at 2 a.m. None of it was flashy. All of it was real. Weeks before the wedding, invoices piled for the lodge, the flowers, the heaters on the terrace, the extra generator because wind likes to make jokes in May. He paid them without a word and wrote Rachel's Day in his notebook because he wanted that day to be clean of worry. On the morning of the wedding, he checked his email one last time and saw a note from Anderson's office about a renewal on favorable terms. He replied, "Approved," and closed the laptop. He ironed his shirt, shined his shoes, and placed the old truck key by the door. He stood for a moment and looked at the northern sky where the light spreads wide and flat, and he felt the old engine inside him running smooth. He believed the night would pass with small slights and no harm, and he believed he could let them pass because he had chosen love over pride. He drove up to the ridgetop lodge, parked where the ice still held in the shade, and carried himself inside like a man who knows his route. He thought his promise to stay quiet would hold. He did not know that a name, his own, cut down to initials, would step into the room without him and speak louder than any toast. After the laughter faded and the quartet slipped back into a slow waltz, the lodge changed its sound the way a river changes after a bend. Not louder, just different. More voices close to Theo's chair, more hands on his shoulder, and he stayed seated at first because he knew a room tells the truth if you let it talk. A cousin leaned down with cheerful pity and told him it was wonderful that he had a hobby now, said retirement was a journey. And Theo nodded once, because arguing with a story people like to tell themselves is work without a finish line. Then a woman from the Groom side compared him to her father, who sold painted carvings at the Saturday market, and said it kept him busy. And Theo said, "Busy is good," and counted the seconds until she went to dance. The servers flowed by, whispering, one hiding a smile after repeating, "Build an empire," under her breath like a punchline. And Theo lifted his water glass and set it down again without drinking because his hands were steady and he wanted them to stay that way. He stood to stretch, told himself he would leave after the cake, keep the peace, drive home under a sky that would not darken for hours. And that would have been the end if the night had been only about jokes. But it kept shaping itself into something else. Jake intercepted him by the bar, clapped his shoulder lightly, said, "Good sport," and talked about the speeches as if they were harmless, like snowballs tossed at a window, then dropped his voice into advice. Don't push too hard with the consulting thing. Don't put pressure on yourself at your age. Paperwork for local shops is a noble way to stay engaged. And Theo, who knew the weight of words in men who don't know they are swinging them, asked, "What do you think I do?" and watched Jake's shrug land between them like a fence. Theo excused himself and walked to the restroom where the hum of the building felt louder, washed his hands in cold water until his pulse settled, looked in the mirror and saw a face that winter had carved with careful lines, a face he knew and trusted. Then returned to the hall with the same even breath he used on docks in storms. At the photo booth, he overheard Rachel tell a bridesmaid that his business was a phase to help him feel important, that at least he wasn't dating, and they laughed like it was safe to do, and Theo kept moving because some words are a blizzard you step around or get buried by. He reached his table and found the groom's boss, Robert Anderson, watching him from table 6 with a curious tilt to his head, the kind you see when a pilot hears an engine note that's almost right, and Anderson stood, walked over with polite pace, and offered a hand. "Mr. North," he said. "Robert Anderson, Sterling Tech." His voice was calm, but his eyes measured, and Theo shook his hand and said, "Nice to meet you," in the way men say it when they note grip, temperature, and intent all at once. Anderson began with small talk, Anchorage weather, the view, the heaters on the terrace, then asked what Theo did, and Theo said, "Operations and acquisitions," in a quiet way that could be mistaken for modesty by people who listen for volume. And Anderson, still careful, asked if Theo worked mostly with small outfits around town. Theo looked at him level, the way you look across a frozen lake you've walked for years, and said, "We help companies run honest and on time," and that was almost nothing and nearly everything. Anderson nodded, but he did not leave. He tapped the base of his glass with one finger, thinking, then said, "Forgive me if this is odd, but do you know a TK North?" And the name hung there like fog off the inlet, and Theo could have let it pass, but he chose not to. He said, "I do," and when Anderson asked, "How?" Theo said, "The K stands for Kenneth, my middle name," and he watched the man's composure slip a half-inch before he caught it again. Anderson inhaled wrong, coughed, held the rim of his glass like it might float away, and whispered, "You're TK North." Not a question, a conclusion arriving at last. He looked down at the floor, up at the band, over at the Sterling managers who had laughed earlier, then back at Theo's face to see if it would turn into someone else's. And when it didn't, his posture changed. Shoulders back, chin down, like a man about to say a thing that matters in a room not built for it. "You own Borealis Systems," he said, lower now. "You're the reason we survived the supply crunch in March." Theo answered with the same 2 words he used when water lines hissed and froze. We adapt. And Anderson nodded like a student, and then like a man who understands the bill for a lesson just arrived. He apologized in a rush for the jokes, for the tone of the night, for the way people had turned an old man into a target because it was warm and easy. And Theo raised a hand gently, stopping him without scolding, and said, "It's a wedding," because context is a kind of mercy. But Anderson's face tightened with a different duty. "Sir," he said, "with respect, half this room is tied to your work. Some draw paychecks from it. Some rely on it to meet their own promises. And we have let them talk like the cold chain is a hobby." Theo could feel the room's temperature in his skin, the way he could feel freezer air without looking at a gauge. Something in the air shifted, as if the building sucked in a breath, and a narrow path opened in front of him. The kind you get between stacked pallets when a forklift needs through and no one said it aloud. He told Anderson he had promised Rachel he would not talk business, that he had sat through the roast because no father wants to crack a celebration down the middle. And Anderson nodded, paused, and looked toward the microphone beside the band, an object suddenly full of gravity. "If I speak," he asked, "will you stop me?" Theo thought of Rachel at 5, asleep in a sled under the northern lights, tiny mittens clenched around nothing. He thought of her tonight, 34, spinning in a circle of friends, sure the world would stay the shape she wanted if she smiled at it hard enough. He weighed pride against peace, truth against timing, and came to a simple rule that had served him in storms. Tell the truth without fire. Correct the course by a degree, not a mile, unless a cliff is close. If you do it, he said, do it clean. No names you don't need. No heat. Let the facts stand up on their own legs. Anderson held his gaze, accepted the terms, and moved away with a purpose that made the band leader look up. Around the hall, conversations were still laughing at old lines, but a quiet spread in rings, as if people could hear weather change through glass. Forks slowed, chairs turned, eyes tracked the man in the dark suit as he reached the little platform and raised one hand to the quartet, and the music softened into a question. Theo stayed where he was, hands resting easy on the back of his chair, not hiding, not stepping forward, not protecting himself with motion, only breathing. And in that stillness, he felt the entire chain of his work like a live wire. From a generator in Seward humming steady, to a temperature alarm cleared in a freezer, to a plane fueled in Fairbanks, to a line of code checking a delivery window for a server that would keep a screen on in this very room. And he understood that whatever came next would not be loud for long, but it would be true. Robert Anderson took the microphone, blinked once at the chandelier glare, found Theo in the crowd, and gave the smallest nod, a signal that one old professional gives another when a job is about to start, and there will be no second attempt. And then he said, "Excuse me," and the lodge fell as quiet as a lake at midnight. Robert Anderson stood on the low platform with the microphone in his hand, the chandelier light catching the smooth silver of the stem, and he said, "Excuse me," in a voice that was not loud but carried, and the quartet let the last note fade like a breath held under ice, and the room stilled. Forks hovered in the air. A server froze with a tray of champagne at shoulder height. The door to the terrace eased closed, as if the wind itself wanted to listen. And Theo stayed by his chair with his hands easy on the backrest, eyes on the man who had asked for this moment, the way a pilot watches a runway light for the signal to land. And Anderson took one step forward and said he owed someone an apology. Then he looked down to table 6, found Theo, and lifted the apology from his own mouth so others would have to carry it too. And he said 5 words that shook the room like a sudden gust across a lake. He is TK North. The sentence was small, but the silence that followed it was large, the kind of silence that makes people glance at each other and then away. And in that quiet, he added simple, plain facts that did not need decoration, saying the bride's father was the founder of Northgate Ventures, that in the last 18 months, he had acquired 6 companies that kept freight moving, power steady, freezers honest, and that one of those companies, Borealis Systems, held the backbone that Sterling Tech leaned on every day. And as he spoke, he seemed to grow calmer, like a man reading instruments he trusts. And he said, some of us in this room signed contracts with this gentleman, took his calls, relied on his teams, and tonight we laughed at him and called his work a phase. The sound that came back was not laughter. It was the clink of glass set down too quickly and a single fork slipping off a plate. And Rachel, who had been a circle of motion all evening, stopped moving in the center of the floor and looked for her father with eyes that were suddenly new, like someone seeing a familiar trail under a fresh fall of snow and realizing it led somewhere else all along. And she said, "Dad," without sound, only with her mouth. And then she looked at Jake, who looked at his boss, who did not look away. Anderson's voice stayed even as he turned a little so more faces could see him. And he said he was sorry for his part in letting the tone of the night tilt toward mocking a man who had, in fact, kept many of their own promises possible. And he said the word thanks like a small bow. And then he did a thing that made the mystery in the room turn toward an answer. He asked the bride's father if he wished to say anything. He lowered the microphone, held it at his side, and waited, which is the kind of respect you do not fake. Theo did not hurry. He slid his hand from the chair, checked his balance the way he always did after long sitting, and walked slow along the aisle that had been left by chance or by the habit of people to make room when truth approaches. And as he passed, he could hear small breaths, the shallow kind people take when they think a sharp thing is coming. He stepped up to the platform, and Anderson gave him the microphone without a whisper, and Theo nodded once, a small thank you, and looked out at the faces that had been warm and easy when they were laughing and were now stiff with the cold of surprise. He cleared his throat and started in a steady way that matched the land outside, simple lines without speed. He said his name, said his age, said he worked in operations and acquisitions, and chose to keep his name off most things because he liked the work to speak first. And he said he had promised Rachel not to talk business tonight, and had planned to keep that promise because a father does not cut his child's day in half just to feel tall. And then he looked at Rachel and said he loved her and had paid what he paid so the night would be smooth, not because he wanted to put a weight on her or make a scene. And his voice did not shake when he said it. He turned to the room and spoke like he was doing a checklist in the dark, slow enough not to miss a line. And he said it was true. He had formed Northgate Ventures. True, he had bought cold storage in Seward, and a data firm in Fairbanks, and maintenance in Seward, and an IT spine in Seattle, and Borealis Systems, to tie them to the truth. And he said none of that made him special. It only made him responsible. And in that word responsible, he put 30 winters of knowing that a missed call can spoil a load and a skipped line can cost a man his job. And he did not repeat any joke. He did not answer any insult. He only spoke as a man who thinks about temperature alarms at 2 a.m. thinks, one item at a time. He said he knew people here had meant no harm when they laughed, that warm rooms make light work of heavy subjects, that it is easy to think old hands should rest when you have not seen what those hands can lift. And then he looked at Jake, not long, just enough, and said, "What do you think I do?" was a real question, and not only a father's pride. He returned his eyes to Rachel and said he was sorry if his quiet had felt like distance, that he had tried to tell her small pieces and had given up when every piece bounced off, a smile meant to change the subject. And he said he would try again if she wanted to listen. And if not, he would still love her and still pay attention to the work that kept lights on and food cold and planes honest. The quartet had not moved. The waiters had not moved. The mountain light had not moved. Only faces moved, and some of them moved inward, softer, as if the words were a hand laid on a shoulder after a long day. Robert Anderson stood near the edge of the platform like a guard who is not needed now that the town sees itself. And the sterling managers at table 8 did not meet each other's eyes. And the man who had compared Theo to a craft table looked like he wanted to step outside and stand in the wind until his cheeks stung back to life. Rachel said "Dad" out loud this time, just once, the sound small but clear. And she pressed 2 fingers against her mouth as if to hold other words in until she could choose them better. Theo did not ask for applause. He did not explain more than he had to. He said he hoped the room would go back to celebrating the couple, and he would be here if anyone wished to offer a handshake or a plate of cake later. And he thanked the band for their patience, and he turned to give the microphone back to Anderson. Anderson did not take it. He lifted a palm to the bandleader, a small request, and the bandleader nodded and began a quiet tune that sounded like a river under thin ice. And the sound moved through the hall without asking permission. And people breathed again. Someone near the back whispered that the old truck outside belonged to a man who owned the software on their phones, then caught himself and smiled at his own smallness. Theo stepped down, walked the same aisle, and returned to his chair with the care of a man who knows floors can be slick even when they look dry. And as he sat, the room rippled in a new way. Not the laughter wave of before, not the panic wave, but the modest push of people getting up to do the right thing one by one. First, Robert Anderson's apology already done, then a manager from Sterling with a stiff bow and a quiet sorry. Then the vendor whose invoice had been paid early in March with thanks for understanding cash flow. And Theo answered each the same way he had answered alarms and drivers for years, with a short yes, a "it's all right," a "enjoy the night." And in those answers, there was the clean edge of a man who did not need them to like him, to keep doing what was right. Outside the glass, the light held on to the edge of the world. Inside, the story that had been told about an old man and his phase lost its shape and fell to the floor like old ribbon. And the new story, the simpler one, stood up on its own legs without help. The waltz stitched the room back together, but the seams were new and everyone could feel them. And Theo sat while the first wave of people came. Apologies mostly, small and awkward, a manager from Sterling with his tie suddenly too tight, a vendor with damp eyes thanking him for paying early in March when her line of credit was thin, a cousin who had laughed loudest now speaking softly about respect. And he answered each the same way, a short nod, a clean "we're fine," a reminder to enjoy the night, because he did not want a second ceremony built around him. Then Jake arrived, pale, his smile gone, and he started with a rush. "Mr. North, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I didn't know." And the words piled up until they had nowhere to go. And Theo set a hand on the table to ground the moment and said, "Jake, you didn't ask." And that sentence landed like a gear dropping into place. Not cruel, just true. And Jake breathed out and nodded because he could not argue with what had been missing. Robert Anderson came next, not to apologize again, he had done that, but to make the change visible. He asked permission with his eyes, then turned toward the nearest cluster of Sterling people and said, clear enough to carry but gentler now, that he would be meeting with them next week to discuss how they spoke about partners in public. That the standard was respect, that jokes were not a problem when they punch up, but are a problem when they punch blind. And he ended with a small bow toward Theo and the kind of handshake men give when they are done pretending. A few guests stiffened at the word meeting, but most only looked relieved that someone had set a line on the floor with tape everyone could see. The cake knife made its first cut. Cheers rose a little too loud. And on the upswell of noise, Rachel slipped from the circle and walked, then almost ran, toward the terrace door, one hand over her mouth, veil brushing a chair back, and Theo watched her go, because a father watches and waits, and he counted to 10 in his head the same way he once counted to 10 before opening a freezer door after an outage. Then he stood up without hurry and followed her out into the long light. The cold air met him first, clean and thin, and then Rachel's breath, quick and shaky, white at the edges as if winter had found her even in May. She stood by the rail with the mountains looking close enough to touch and said, without turning, "Dad, I was awful." And he said, "You were careless," because that word was fair and could be repaired. And she turned and the tears came all at once, big child tears that pay no attention to makeup. And she said she thought the business was a phase. She thought he needed something to do so he wouldn't feel alone. She thought if she laughed at it, she could keep it small and safe. And Theo listened, like he listened to compressors and bearings, hearing where the noise came from. Not only that, it was loud. He told her he had tried to tell her, small pieces over dinners she filled with other things, and that he had stopped when each piece bounced. He told her he kept his name quiet because work speaks better than pride, and because it was easier to hire good people when no one expected a parade. He told her that love without listening is only noise, and that he would start again if she did. She nodded and nodded, hair sticking to her cheeks, and said she was ashamed, that she had stood with a microphone and made her father small in a room he had paid to warm. And he said, yes, that happened, and we are here now, which is what can be done with a true thing. They stood in the wind and let it pull the heat from the moment until the words cooled into decisions. She asked, small as a child, if he would stay for the father-daughter dance, and he said, yes, of course. And when she leaned in, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, the same one he carried in case a valve bled, and gave it to her. And she laughed once at the old-fashioned square of cloth and pressed it to her eyes. Behind them, the door eased open and closed with soft thumps as people stepped out to look at the view and stepped back in when the chill bit. And Robert Anderson slipped out once, stood a polite distance away, and said, Miss Rachel, your father is a good man and a good operator. Those are rare together. And Rachel managed a thank you through the cloth, while Anderson nodded to Theo and returned inside to keep the room from drifting into a new kind of clumsy. Theo and Rachel walked in after a minute, not to a cheer, but to space forming, the natural aisle that appears when a crowd decides not to be in the way. The DJ, who had seen bar fights and reconciliations and could read a room like weather, announced the father-daughter dance without commentary. And a simple song started, steady and unshowy. And Rachel put her hand on Theo's shoulder, and they moved in a small circle on a floor that had held many kinds of feet. She cried a little more, quiet now, and said sorry again. And Theo said, we'll talk Sunday, because setting a time is better than making promises under chandeliers. When the song ended, applause came, kinder than before, and people drifted back to their tables with the softer voices of a town after a storm breaks and the power returns. A man who had compared Theo to craft tables came with a plate of cake and a sincere apology. And Theo took the cake and the apology and said, eat before it dries. And the man laughed, relief loosening his shoulders. Jake approached once more, alone this time, and asked if he could come to Sunday. And Theo said yes, but warned him that questions would be asked both ways. And Jake swallowed and agreed. He said he had thought progress meant shiny things and loud people, and that he had forgotten the quiet hands that make the loud possible. And Theo said learning that now was better than learning it at 45. Before the night ended, 3 guests quietly asked Theo for advice on contracts or staffing, and he waved them off with a business card and a line to call next week. The wedding was not a trade show. Not for him. Not tonight. Robert Anderson found the microphone one last time near closing and gave a small toast that did not mention names, only the hope that love and work would both be done with care in this family, that mockery would be replaced with curiosity, and that the room had witnessed a standard worth keeping, and glasses lifted and clinked without a speechmaker's roar. When the last song played and the new couple walked through a tunnel of sparklers toward a car dressed in ribbons, Rachel paused at the end, turned back, and wrapped Theo in a careful hug that did not crush his boutonniere. And she said, I'm proud of you, Dad. And he said, I've always been proud of you. And then she was gone into the May night, and the parking lot lights blinked on in a line like runway beacons. Theo stood beside his old F-150 for a moment, hand on the cool metal, and looked back at the lodge, the glass now dark mirrors with the mountains faint behind them. And he thought about the 5 words that had changed the shape of the evening, and how simple they were. And he thought about Sunday pancakes and a conversation that would need patience and rules. And he thought about the freezers humming, the alarms quiet, the crews finishing shifts under bright warehouse lights. He slid into the truck, turned the key, and let the engine catch, steady as always. And as he drove down the ridge road toward the sleeping city, he felt the night relax around him like a coat settling on shoulders. And he knew the work would be waiting in the morning. And that was a comfort, a map, a mystery solved for now and opened again tomorrow. Because that is how honest work and family both go in a place where the light lingers and winter tests what you build. In the first week after the wedding, Theo kept his promise and met Rachel on Sunday morning at a diner that smelled like coffee and cinnamon, and they ordered blueberry pancakes because simple food made hard talk easier, and he began by telling her one true thing at a time. No speeches. how he chose the name Northgate, why he signs emails as TK North, how a freezer alarm at 2:13 a.m. is not just noise but a question. And Rachel listened without interrupting, nodding, sometimes staring at her plate like the pattern there could hold her steady, then asking short questions that sounded like doors finally opening. And when she cried, he handed her the handkerchief again and said they would take this slow. A week later, Jake came too, sat stiff for the first 10 minutes, then loosened as Theo explained a route map on a napkin, showing how 10 lost minutes at the start turn into an hour by night. And Jake said he had never thought of time as a cargo, and Theo said time is the first cargo and everything else rides on it. In the second week, Robert Anderson called and asked if Theo would walk the Sterling team through how Borealis Systems had saved them during the spring crunch. Not a show, just a working session. And Theo agreed on one condition. The meeting would be small, no stage, only the people who actually touched the work. They met in a plain conference room with dry erase boards and coffee that went cold too fast. And Theo asked their planner to pull up the week in March when a vendor failed, and then he outlined what had been done, switching to a backup lane, changing a freezer defrost window by 30 minutes, pulling one driver off a long route to run a shuttle between two short ones. And he spoke in plain words that did not make anyone feel small. And at the end, he said the line he always used: "Tell the truth fast. Fix small before it becomes big. Leave things better than you found them." And the room wrote it down like a checklist. Rachel called after that and said she wanted to see a warehouse for real, not just pictures. And Theo told her to bring steel-toe boots, and he would supply the hard hat. On a gray Tuesday, he met her at the Seward facility, signed her in, and walked her through the entry where warm air met cold like two hands pressed together. And he stopped at the first control panel and showed her the numbers. Not just the temperatures, but the trends. Little lines climbing or staying flat. And he said the mystery in his work was simple. Why did this line move when it should not? Who touched this valve? What changed at 3:07 when the plan said nothing would change? Rachel followed each answer with another question. And by noon, she had grease on her cuff and did not care. On the way out, Sierra, the lead, told Rachel how they had saved $100,000 of halibut once by trusting an alarm that didn't seem urgent at first, and Rachel looked at her father like she was seeing the outline of his days at last. In the fourth week, winter hinted early, a thin skin of ice on puddles near the loading dock, and Theo felt the old alertness return to his bones. He started sleeping with his phone on the pillow again, ringer up, the way he did when storms stacked over the Gulf, and he told his team to run drills on generator startups and to check the spare gaskets they kept just in case. He did not say he could smell trouble in the way the wind slipped under the doors, but he could. The trouble came 2 Saturdays later, not dramatic at first, only a series of small things that did not line up. A temperature drift of half a degree in freezer 3 at 1:42 p.m., a momentary flicker on a control panel at 1:47, and a truck that should have checked in at 2 Road, calling in at 2:11 to report black ice on the highway and a slow crawl. Theo was at the Anchorage office, reading a maintenance log, when the first alert buzzed his phone, and he said, "I'm heading down," to no one in particular, and was already out the door. He drove the F-150 through thin snow that the tires cut like lines in paper and reached the Seward yard at 3:58, where Sierra met him with a tablet and a worried look held tight. Inside, freezer 3 held at set point again, the drift gone as if it had never been, which was not comfort but a puzzle, and Theo stood in the hum, eyes moving from the control screen to the frost pattern on the evaporator, to the drip pan, to the floor drain. Simple things that tell the truth if you look long enough. He asked who had opened the door and when. He asked which defrost cycle had just finished. He asked if anyone heard a new sound, and Sierra said there was a faint rattle near the top coil, there and gone. And Theo said, "Let's listen," and they did. The way people listen in an empty church when a storm walks around the roof, and there it was again, a thin rattle, like a washer vibrated loose somewhere behind the panel. He asked for Jake to be put on speaker because Jake had been asking for real problems to think about. And Jake answered on the third ring, breathless from jogging, and said he could talk. Theo told him what they were seeing and asked what questions he would ask first. And Jake said, after a pause, he would check the sensor because a lying measurement could make a good system look bad. And Theo nodded even though Jake could not see it and said, "Good. What else?" And Jake said he would check the drain because ice in the wrong place tells lies too. They pulled the front panel with careful hands, stepped back from the cold cloud that rolled out, and looked at the sensor seat. The clip was firm, but the cable showed a small scuff where it ran across a sheet metal edge. Nothing much, but enough to vibrate and send noise into the line. Theo asked for tape, a new clip, and a tie to move the cable off the edge, and they did it in 2 minutes and logged the change. Still, he was not satisfied, not with that rattle in the ceiling coil. He climbed the ladder himself, slow but steady, and pressed a gloved hand against the shroud. There, the rattle sharpened. And he told Sierra to kill power to the fan bank for 30 seconds, then bring it up one by one. Fan 1 spun smooth, fan 2 hummed, fan 3 vibrated and made the small metallic noise they had heard. Sierra shut it down, and Theo took off the shroud screws with the patience of a man who refuses to strip a thread, and when the cover came off, they found the culprit. A fan blade hairline crack near the hub that only sang when speed hit a certain point. The kind of flaw that comes from a bad batch or an unnoticed nudge during cleaning. It had not failed yet, but it would, and when it did, it would turn Freezer 3 into a warm room in under an hour. He told Sierra to pull the spare from the parts rack. He knew there was one because he ordered it after a similar crack 5 years ago, and in 20 minutes, the new blade was in, the shroud back, the screws seated, the fan spun up, and the rattle gone. At 5:22 p.m., the panel showed a clean line, no drift, and Theo let the hum of the room move through him until his shoulders let go. He called Jake back and told him the steps they took and why, and Jake said, very quietly, that it felt like watching someone read a crime scene that wasn't dramatic but mattered more because no one would have seen it if they didn't look. And Theo said that was most of the work. He texted Rachel a photo of the steady line on the screen with a single word, "solved." And she replied with a heart, and then, a minute later, "Can I come watch next time?" And he wrote back, "Yes, boots." On the drive home, snow thickened, and the highway turned into a slow white ribbon, and Theo felt the old tiredness that comes after a problem is put to bed, the good kind, and he thought about how mysteries in his life had changed. Once it was why a marriage cooled without a fight, now it was why a coil sang at one speed and not another. And both required the same tools, attention, patience, and the courage to say a thing is not right, even when no one else hears it. On Sunday, pancakes again. Rachel asked him to explain the difference between a bad sensor and a true drift. And he drew a quick picture and then put the pen down because he saw she was really asking how to tell when a person is lying to themselves and when they are only scared. And he said the only way is to listen longer than is comfortable and to check small things before you decide big things. And she wrote that down like it was a rule. By the end of the month, small changes had settled into their family, like furniture moved into better places. Jake stopped making little jokes about retirement and started asking for books to read. Rachel apologized to her maid of honor on her own without being told. Theo added 3 apprentices to Sierra's crew and told them to keep a notebook and a pencil in their pocket always. One night, when the sky over Anchorage went clear and green with northern lights, Rachel sent a photo and a message that said, "I think I understand about quiet work." And Theo stood on his balcony with his coffee and answered, "It's all anyone sees at the end." And he meant the lights and the work and the long thread between them that holds if you tie it right. By early winter, snow sat heavy on Anchorage roofs and the days were short, and Theo settled into a steady rhythm that felt clean. Sundays with Rachel and sometimes Jake at the diner, weekdays split between the Anchorage office and the Seward yard, and quiet evenings checking logs with coffee while the city lights blinked under the cold. Then the forecast changed and the radio repeated the same words all day. Blizzard warning, high winds, risk of rolling outages. And Theo did what he always did before bad weather. He called Sierra to run the generator drill again. He asked Marco to confirm spare belts and gaskets. He sent a note to the Seattle IT team to stage backups for Borealis systems. He asked the apprentices to check every door sweep and floor drain, and he sent Rachel a simple message: "Storm night, come see." She texted back a yes and a picture of her boots. On the afternoon, the storm arrived. Wind pushed fine snow sideways like smoke, and the sky went gray early. Rachel and Jake met Theo at the Anchorage office, where the screens showed temperatures, truck feeds, and timed routes moving across the map. And Theo pointed to two lines on the main board: Freezer 3 Seward, Freezer 2 Anchorage, because those two carried the most fragile loads, a slice for a hospital blood bank, and a high-value shipment of fresh fish bound for a plane if the runway held. The first hour went smooth. Trucks checked in slower than usual, but still on time, and the power dipped once and recovered. And then at 1922, the office lights blinked and the boards flickered and came back because the building had a backup. And Theo said, "There it is," and took the first deep breath he had been holding since morning. An alert hit the board a minute later. Freezer 2 Anchorage temperature drift plus 0.7 degrees Celsius and climbing. A second alert followed. Generator auto start reported online, load at 78%, no faults. A third alert, Stranger said Freezer 2 defrost cycle engaged at 1919, even though the schedule did not allow a defrost that hour. Theo stood up and went down to the floor with Rachel on his heels and Jake behind them, and they entered the cold room and listened to the sound of fans and compressors and the way the wind outside threw itself at the building. And he asked the tech on duty what he touched in the last hour, and the tech said nothing. And Theo nodded and looked at the coil faces and the frost pattern in the drain pan and saw a shine he did not like, a gloss that meant more water than there should be. He said, "Show me the defrost log." And the apprentice pulled it up. It showed a normal cycle at 17, next scheduled at 21, but also a manual defrost at 1919 with the user field blank. Rachel stared at the log and said, "Why is the user blank?" And Theo said, "It should not be." And he asked who had admin rights, and the tech named 3 people and none of them were on shift. And he told Marco to lock out remote access and to stand ready to switch Freezer 2 to manual if the drift hit plus 1.5 degrees Celsius. He called Sierra to check Seward. She said they were holding, wind high but steady, and asked if he needed help in Anchorage. He said not yet. Another alert hit. Truck 17 on the inbound to Anchorage delayed by road closure. That truck carried the backup dry ice meant for contingencies like this. Jake called the dispatcher and heard the driver say he was sitting behind a jackknifed rig near a bridge. Rachel looked at the route board and said, "Truck 12 is closer to the supplier. It could pull the dry ice and run the short leg." And Theo nodded because it was a good catch, and he told dispatch to switch assignments and to make sure someone called the supplier so they did not shut their dock early. Back at Freezer 2, the line hit plus 1.2 degrees Celsius and then held flat, which was not good enough, and Theo asked the apprentice to open the control panel and show the defrost relay. The relay was warm. The coil face still looked too wet. He suspected a stuck signal or a setting changed without malice during a routine service. The sort of small wrong that becomes a big wrong in a storm. He told Rachel to watch the coil face for a minute and say what she saw. She said the top edge dried first and the bottom edge stayed wet longer. That told Theo where the heat was concentrating in defrost and where it was not. And he told the tech to pull the defrost heater fuses one at a time and check resistance to find a failed or shorted element. The readings came back normal, which sent him back to the schedule. He asked who had installed the controller last month, and the tech said a vendor. And Theo said, "Call me the changelog." And the apprentice pulled it up and found a small line in a long list that said, "Added service window 1915 to 1925 for coil inspection. Test defrost enabled," and no one had removed that line afterward. The fix was simple once they saw it. Theo told Marco to remove the service window, disable manual defrost, and lock the setting. He made a note to call the vendor after the storm. He looked at the line on the board, still flat, not dropping yet, and he said, "Manual now." and the tech flipped Freezer 2 to manual control and cut all defrost heaters. And in 5 minutes, the temperature began to slide back towards set point, slow but sure. At 20 per 10, the generator load spiked to 92% for a short, hard minute and dropped. Theo did not like the spike. He checked the building panel and saw a heater bank in a neighboring space had tried to come back on after the power dip. He told the building manager to kill it, that tonight was not a night for comfort heat. Tonight was a night for steady load. Truck 12 reached the supplier, loaded dry ice, and turned back, and dispatch confirmed road conditions had worsened. Jake suggested a police escort, and Theo said not necessary yet, and they stayed with normal rules because normal rules worked when you saw problems early. At 2100, the scheduled defrost for Freezer 2 came, and they walked it in manual. Heaters on for half time, fans staged, drains checked, door closed and tagged. The line on the board dipped, then steadied right on set point. Rachel exhaled and smiled and looked back at the room, not at her father, and only then let herself look at him. At 2240, a second problem arrived, this one out of Seward. Freezer 3 line showed small saw teeth. Not a drift, but a pattern you get when something cycles too often. Sierra said she heard a click in the contactor box. Theo asked her to switch to the backup contactor. They kept mounted in place. She did, and the teeth smoothed. He told her to tag the old one and log the hours so they would not be surprised by it later. Midnight came. The storm reached its middle. Wind howled across the dock walls and made the building tremble like a ship. Theo sent half the crew to rest and kept half on because tired hands make expensive mistakes. Rachel carried coffee and wrote timestamps in a notebook without being asked. Jake learned to read the board without speaking. At 2:15, the city cut power to a quadrant, and the Anchorage building went fully to generator. The line held. At 3, Truck 12 pulled into the yard, and the driver walked in with a grin and a story about a snowplow that saved his hour. Theo handed him a cup of soup from the break room and thanked him by name because names keep men upright at that hour. By 04:30, the worst was over. The wind eased and the outage map showed crews working. Theo stayed until the sun limped up behind cloud, and then he stood in the quiet hum and let his shoulders drop. He thanked the team and told them to go home in pairs. He told the apprentices to write what they learned in a notebook before sleep washed it away. He told Rachel she could keep the hard hat if she wanted, and she said she did. Later that morning, after the roads cleared a little, they met at the diner for pancakes and silence, and then Rachel said, "Dad, I understand better now why you never make a big speech." And he said, "Big speeches don't move air through a coil." And Jake laughed in the way a man laughs when a lesson lands for good. Over the next weeks, small things changed that mattered more than large ones. Rachel asked to sit in on a vendor call and listened all the way through. Jake started carrying a small notebook and a pencil like Theo. The apprentices began a ritual of drawing one diagram a week and explaining it to the crew. Robert Anderson came by one evening with a box of donuts and a question about load shedding. And he stood on the floor and let Sierra teach him, and he thanked her like a boss should. When winter finally stepped back and the spring wind smelled like wet wood instead of iron, Rachel stood by the Seward dock in a bright coat and watched a pallet slide into a slot like choreography and said, "It's beautiful." And Theo said, "It holds," because that was the word that mattered most to him. On a clear night soon after, the northern lights hung like green curtains, and Theo stood on his balcony with coffee while his phone rested quiet on the table. The city below was fed. The hospital cold stores were full, the trucks were parked straight, and the boards showed even lines. He thought of the wedding, of the 5 words that had turned a warm room into silence, and he decided a name was only a tool, same as a wrench or a relay. What mattered was what you turned with it. He went inside, wrote 3 lines on a card for the apprentices. Tell the truth fast, fix small before big, leave it better, and taped it to the break room fridge, and in the morning he found someone had added a 4th line in messy pencil. Listen longer than is comfortable, and he smiled and left it there.